Hi, everybody. Welcome back. So today we are going to be looking at Judaism and gender yet again. Surprise, surprise. And I thought it would be interesting to look at modern Israel and kind of just the founding of the state and how Zionist ideology also has sort of gendered ideas of identity and how this plays into what becomes the nascent state of Israel and kind of how we see gender playing a role in Israeli life today. So this was obviously planned and thought up prior to recent events. Um, or if something comes up, feel free to bring that up. That was not really the focus that I was thinking of for this evening, but I also recognize that the plan I had for this lecture, sort of the reality of it all has changed since October 7th. So um, anyway, with that in mind, we can move ahead. And just again, I like to start with a reminder of what we have talked about and where we have been, especially if anyone was to join or watch at a later point and think, oh, I want to go back to this. I think I missed something. So our first 2 weeks, we were focusing on the Hebrew Bible more specifically, and how gender plays a role and how we can sort of read certain texts looking at um, how gender is portrayed. Um, and last week we looked at post-biblical literature, starting actually with some biblical literature with Song of Songs. Oh, I actually changed this this bullet here. I meant to change the subheading, but the lecture changed a little bit, so this is not actually super accurate, but that's okay. You'll be a little surprised what we're looking at. Um, I had this idea that we would start with kind of a look at King David as the kind of archetypal um, Israelite king and a model for sort of Jewish identity. And there's a lot there to kind of unpack in terms of his own relationship with his sexuality, his own sexual potency, how he sort of at various points actually takes advantage of his power to manipulate men and women to get what he wants. Um, but seeing as it's also Hanukkah, I actually thought that a better place to start tonight would be to look um, at this notion of the Maccabees and the Hanukkah story as our kind of entry point for the modern state of Israel. And so there's this quote by Herzl um, talking about how the Maccabees will rise again. Just so we're all clear, does anyone want to refresh our memories on who Herzl is? I'm assuming we might be familiar with this guy, but just in case, I don't want to leave anybody hanging. Feel free to chime in. I can't see you right now. Any guesses? All right, if no one has anything, I will just say Theodor Herzl is generally acknowledged as the father of the modern Zionist movement, and a major leader um, in sort of establishing this ideology that there should be a Jewish state as a response to anti-Semitism that he saw and observed in the world. He wasn't himself really a religious Jew before. He was a journalist, and he was sort of motivated to action in witnessing this trial of a Jewish man who is presumed to be a military traitor, Dreyfus, yada, yada, yada. He ends up being kind of one of the central figures of the early Zionist movement. Um, and so he points to the Maccabees as a kind of model for this new Jew, this new Zionist. So the Maccabees will rise again. He says, a wondrous generation of Jews will spring into existence. We shall live at last as free men on our own soil. The world will be liberated by our emancipation. Oh, is there someone? wanting to chime in or just unmute? If there's a question, just let me know. So the world will be liberated by our emancipation, enriched by our wealth, magnified by our greatness. Whatever we accomplish there for our own welfare will spread and rebound powerfully and beneficially for the good of all humanity. So already we can see this identification of sort of the fighters of the Maccabees and this story of Hanukkah of liberation and reclaiming of space from Hellenizing Greek powers in the ancient lands of Israel as a kind of model for how Jewish resistance and Jewish life should exist with this new found state, this new ideology of Zionism. And so the victory of the Maccabees serves as a foundational myth for the modern state of Israel. There's this emphasis on kind of religious zealotry and the righteousness of engaging in battle, defeating one's enemies. The story of Judah Maccabee and all the brothers is kind of this model of Jewish strength, of Jewish resistance, and Jewish might. And if we look back on the story as a kind of historical telling or narrative of what's actually going on in ancient Israel, the result of the Hanukkah story is the start of the Hasmonean dynasty. So the Maccabees form their own dynasty where they kind of innovate here. There was prior to the rise of the Hasmonean dynasty, the priesthood and the military leaders were separate entities, but the Hasmoneans are priests who also take political and military power. And so, you know, I think that there is something to be said in the identification of the Zionist movement with this kind of military focused strength. And so there's a quote that I have from another early Zionist figure, Yosef Trumpeldor: "It is good to die for our country." And so what we see in a lot of early Zionist literature is this readiness for national martyrdom. So Philip Hollander calls this like kind of the sine qua non for a Zionist masculinity that fostered Jewish settlement in Palestine. Yeah, Ellis, there's a question.
Yeah, this kind of gets to what's going on right now.
Yeah.
But I wasn't aware that the notion of Zionism implied that they would fight for the land. I had a feeling that they just felt like they would settle the land on their kibbutz and be peaceful, you know, cohabitants with the Palestinians. That was the plan. But it sounds like they were prepared, as you're saying, from the very beginning, to have to fight
Yeah,
the Palestinians.
That's a really interesting point you bring up, and I think that thank you for mentioning that. I think that there is kind of both things can be true at once. There seems to have been an awareness from sort of Zionist leadership and from the people at the forefront of this movement that there would need to be sort of armed resistance. There would need to be this kind of fighting power. I also think it likely can be said that many of the people settling there who were fleeing anti-Semitism may have, you know, not necessarily come with those intentions, but we do see pretty clearly reflected in some of the early Zionist texts, this sort of awareness and focus actually on sort of strength on and what seems to be perceived as a kind of masculine response. And obviously that's steeped in, you know, a ton of gender expectations and assumptions. But many scholars I link this with a kind of masculine ideology and perspective and attitude of the early Zionist movement, which we're going to see serves as kind of a response to, in many ways, a perceived feminization or softness of European Jewry. So yeah, Aaron, you had also raised your hand.
Yeah, I have a question.
Mhm.
But I assume, I mean, masculine characteristics isn't the same thing as excluding women. So, I assume that women were part of the military from the beginning. Is
I
that
believe
wrong?
I'm not sure exactly from the beginning. We're going to talk a little bit more sort of about inclusion and the women's place within Israeli society. But I think, sort of suffice it to say, there is definitely a move towards these masculine ideals. Whether or not you had to actually be male to be part of that and enact that, I think is a bit of a different question. Um, but there is certainly an attitude of this kind of brute masculine force that is needed to establish dominance in this new land that's being settled. And so I just sort of thought that also this image on the right here of the Israeli beer Maccabi kind of spoke to how embedded the Maccabees and sort of the story of Hanukkah and this ideology is in the Israeli consciousness, that it's like their national brand of beer, and this was an intentional thing early on. And so I think that's something to take note of. I have a short audio clip that I wanted to share too. As I was kind of gathering sources, I happened to come across a very brief NPR feature that was talking about the story of Hanukkah, especially right now. And I thought that this might just sort of add some perspective to what we're discussing. So yeah, Karen says Ruth Westheimer fought in the Haganah. Yeah, so we're going to find like there's a lot of women who were early involved in the Haganah, in the Palmach, in these early institutions of Jewish, Palestinian, and Israeli resistance and the settlements and stuff. So definitely women are there from the beginning. So thank you for that. Yeah, so I'm going to play this audio clip. Let me know. There shouldn't be a problem with the audio, but let me know if there is.
Tonight is the start of Hanukkah. The holiday commemorates an ancient military campaign in the Holy Land, and as war unfolds there today, many American Jews are thinking about how this old story resonates in the current moment. Dina Pritchett reports.
The Hanukkah story is the story of a Greek king who outlawed Jewish worship and desecrated the temple in Jerusalem, and a small group of Jewish rebels who fought back and won.
We can't help but look at what happened then and what is happening now in parallel terms. And that is an attempt to basically annihilate and extinguish the Jewish presence in the land of Israel.
Stuart Weinblatt is the rabbi of Congregation B'nai Tzedek in Potomac, Maryland, and the founder of the Rabbinic Zionist Coalition. This year, what he's taking from the Hanukkah story is the inspiration of a small band of Jews who prevailed, even, he says, when the world was stacked against them.
Hanukkah is a story with many different dimensions to it. Sometimes it can be one of the Rorschachs of Jewish holidays in certain respects. But ultimately, Hanukkah is the story of a battle against anti-Semites, the battle for Judaism to survive.
But battles aren't always black and white. Shia Cohen teaches Jewish history at Harvard University. He says these rebels, the Maccabees, took a heroic stand for Jewish survival. But the dynasty that descended from them was complicated.
One way to look at them down the road is that they do become religious zealots and they do become persecutorial.
They installed themselves as priests of the temple in Jerusalem.
At some point, their battle was not for the temple, the battle was for themselves. They seemed to be just like everybody else, trying to establish themselves in power, trying to beat up their neighbors.
I feel like every year I struggle with the story, right? I don't think that I would be a Maccabee.
Rabbi Alyssa Wise founded the organization Rabbis for Ceasefire after the current conflict erupted between Israel and Hamas. She says the Maccabees' use of violence in the Hanukkah story, even for the cause of religious freedom, has always been upsetting. And now
I'm too aware of the ways in which this story this year is going to be used to justify what I feel is completely unjustifiable. The gruesome cruelty that the Israeli government is enacting on thousands of innocent Palestinians.
What Wise is drawing strength from this year is a different part of the Hanukkah story.
In the Talmud, the rabbis kind of pivoted away from the military story of the Book of Maccabees and instead sought to put center stage a story of a miracle.
The menorah Jews will be lighting tonight commemorates this miracle. After the temple in Jerusalem was reclaimed, an oil lamp was lit to rededicate it as a holy site. The fact that a tiny jar of oil lasted long enough to keep the flame going until more oil could be made is seen as a divine miracle. But Rabbi Ayelet Cohen, dean of the rabbinical school at the Jewish Theological Seminary, says just choosing to light the lights, taking action to repair, even when the task seems doomed, is a human miracle.
The fact that the Maccabees knew there was no way the oil remaining would last for enough days, and they decided to do it anyway, meant that they were choosing hope over despair.
It's that hope that Cohen says is needed this year. Some rabbis are focusing on their hope that the Jewish state will prevail, no matter the cost. Others on the hope for an end to violence now.
The miracle of Hanukkah is that the light expands, that it's possible to see hope increasing, compassion increasing, possibilities for a new future increasing. That's the work of this time.
And she prays that it can be the miracle of this time as well. For NPR News, I'm Dina Pritchett.
All right. Any thoughts or any responses to that little segment? Lynn?
So that's very nice, but the part about Hanukkah, but the fact is there was this one little line that was dropped that conveys, I just sent somebody a message about this, what people are erroneously saying, everything would be just fine if Israel would stop their cruel, horrible bombing of the Gaza Strip. And it forgets that somebody else started it and streamed live in real time these horrible atrocities, even though granted, 1,200 people were killed then. This is now 10 times as many, which is...
Yeah. Are you still there? I think you may have frozen. Lynn? Give her a second. Does anybody else have any thoughts or? And part of the reason, just sort of as a heads up, why I thought that might be interesting is there are multiple perspectives. And I think oh, Shoshana? Yeah. I didn't want to, thank you. Shoshana says there are too many sides to take one. I just want people to stop killing each other. I think that's an excellent point as well. Oh, you're back, Lynn.
Yeah, it's been doing this. It's kicked me off Zoom now a couple of times. So I moved to a different place in my apartment. So there was a piece in yesterday's Times, which I thought really encapsulated very well what's going on. But the world doesn't see it that way, which is that the Jews and the Palestinians are both indigenous populations that inhabit the same space. But unfortunately, the notion that Israel is at fault and their colonial power has taken hold pretty much everywhere. And it's unfortunate because that's not accurate.
Yeah, that's definitely an important perspective there. I didn't want to kind of delve too far either into one side of being right or wrong, but I thought that the Hanukkah story did sort of lend itself well to this kind of reflection. And I also just, as I was preparing this lecture, something really relevant came up. So I thought maybe it would just sort of inspire some thought and maybe some further questions. Karen, I see a hand from you as well.
Yeah, so it's interesting the perspective that the priests or the religious people wanted to divert the attention from the fighting to the oil and the miracle of the oil.
Yeah.
It seems like, you know, maybe they didn't do that in the midst of the battle necessarily, but perhaps we can rewrite history in a way to focus in on something miraculous as a result of this particular situation that's in the present, thinking about, well, how can we frame this for future historians?
Yeah. Thank you. That's a great point, and kind of also where I wanted to go with this as well. There is this idea that was brought up in that little segment about how the ancient rabbis actually aren't so focused on sort of the violence and the fighting aspect. It's more of an emphasis on the miracle, which actually doesn't appear in the text of Maccabees that we have in our apocrypha, in the apocrypha, and in the scriptures. But this was really interesting to me because what we find from the rabbinic period really until sort of the Enlightenment and the rise of the Zionist movement is this shift away from this kind of dominance and strength as masculine power. There's we're going to get there in a second. I guess I'm a little too ahead of myself. Before, I just wanted to also add, I found this image that I thought was very compelling and interesting. If anyone's familiar with the song Mi Yamalel, the Hanukkah song, Mi Yamalel. So the lyrics here I have in English: who can retell the things that befell us, who can count them? In every age, a hero or sage came to our aid. Hark! In days of yore, in Israel's ancient land, brave Maccabees led the faithful band. But now all Israel must as one arise, redeem itself through deed and sacrifice. And so what you have here is a direct correlation by this artist of Judah Maccabee entering Jerusalem in 165 BC or BCE, as we might say, and the British general Allenby following the Declaration of Balfour in 1917 and the commitment to the establishment of a Jewish state. And so there is this very conscious correlation that is drawn between the story of the Maccabees and the rise of Zionism and the coming establishment of the state of Israel. But this is actually in kind of contrast to how the story would have been thought about earlier in antiquity and through much of Jewish history. Perhaps that's how Netanyahu wants to be remembered. Yeah, that's kind of a dark thought as well. So in contrast to what we find a bit later, in pre-modern Jewish culture, the scholar Daniel Boyarin has talked about how there is kind of the ideal man is more of a gentle, timid, studious man. And he's very invested in his studies. He's not going out in the world and fighting in these battles. It's not a desexualized, but more what Boyarin calls a sort of demasculinized ideal. He is still a romantic ideal, but there is just less of an emphasis in rabbinic literature on the fighter and the warrior, and more so on, the wise, learned rabbis. And so there is this kind of association that comes, and part of this is through a history of anti-Semitism and assumptions. But some of this we see also sort of reinforced by the emphases that the rabbis take and make in their literature, and kind of the shift away from this radical violence that we see in some of the ancient texts like Maccabees. And we see more of a movement towards just kind of like studying. And so there's this ideal of the Edelkeit, of this like studious male. And Boyarin and other scholars have asserted that some of the early Zionist movement actually is in part a response not just to rising anti-Semitism and the persecution that Jews were facing, but also this idea of Jews as being sort of soft, as being quote unquote feminized. Obviously, we're using that with scare quotes. We're not taking that as, you know, there's, what does that mean to be feminized? But this is just a way of thinking about it. And so there is this shift we see in early Zionist ideology and literature towards reclaiming the physical Jew and kind of the strength, the brawn, this masculine power. And this is really reflected in the statements of Herzl's Chief Lieutenant Max Nordau in 1898, who calls for this like muscular form of Judaism and a transformation of the frightened Jew in the ghetto. So really emphasizing this shift from a perceived sort of submissive, weaker Jewish existence in the world, which, you know, if we think critically on, is probably influenced by centuries, if not millennia, of persecution and of, you know, not feeling welcome in the spaces they're in. But there is this response. Yeah, Lynn says the idea that the pious Torah scholar is feminized is relative, but that was a goal that many were to strive for. Agreed. And so that's why there is this ideal of that. It's just a very different, and it's in contrast to a lot of sort of the Gentile ideas of masculinity that we see elsewhere in the world, and kind of the Christian archetypal hero as this like beacon of strength. The Jewish hero from a rabbinic perspective is a little bit different. But what early Zionist thinking is kind of coming at is that this model of masculinity is perhaps not working for them. And so there is this shift towards a kind of masculinized and muscular Jew. And so there's this quote here: "Let us take up our oldest traditions." This is from Max Nordau. "Let us once more become deep-chested, sharp-eyed men. For no other people will gymnastics fulfill a more educational purpose for us. It will straighten us in body and in character. Our new muscle Jews have not yet regained the heroism of our forefathers, who in large numbers eagerly entered the sports arenas in order to take part in competition and to pit themselves against the highly trained Hellenistic athletes." And there's another quote too about the formation following the speech of this gymnastics club that was named after the Jewish rebel Bar Kokhba. Bar Kokhba was the last embodiment in world history of a bellicose militant Jewry, made a Jewish gymnastics club flourish and thrive and become an example to be imitated. So we see this very conscious shift again towards a different idea of what it means to be a Jew, and a different ideal, which is rooted in kind of these masculine archetypes and characteristics. And Karen, you said some people in the USA feel that is what has happened in the Trump ascent, with masculinity being embraced by Republicans. I think that's a really interesting parallel that you draw there. Did you have anything else on that note that you wanted to add, Karen? Or
well, you know, with the move to equality in this country, men, I think some men feel threatened by the fact that women are taking their positions, their professional careers are endangered, and their place in the home as the main power of decision making, etc., has drastically changed since the 1950s. And so that is the male vote was the strongest for Trump, although there were women who voted for Trump. Obviously it was right. So the masculinity is some people feel threatened by the move towards equality for women.
Yeah,
in this country. It's a similar kind of backlash.
Yeah. And I think what you're kind of identifying here is this response to a perceived sort of shift and a kind of shifting of the ground of men's positionality. And I think we can similarly see the persecution that Jews were facing, especially in Eastern Europe, like the number of pogroms, and feeling like, you know, there needs to be a shift in kind of the strategy and how they position themselves in the world. So yeah, I think that's a really
the additional aspect is that in this country, Jews have been moving towards equality in our society, and there may be people who feel threatened by that also because they view us as the other still.
Mhm. Yeah. Thank you, Karen. Aaron, I see you also had a hand, right?
Yeah, but there's a piece missing here that you have to explain, which
Okay.
is if the first Zionist women were all on board with this militancy and this physicality, then it's not masculine anymore, it's everybody. Is that what was going on then or not?
We're going to kind of come to that, I think, a little bit. I think that there is what it seems to me, and this could be interpretive as well. So, you know, I don't think there's one right answer. But one thing that I sort of see in this rhetoric is in some ways a distinction between actual men and women, and more of a sort of national character that is being sort of developed. And so I think both men and women play into and, you know, are part of that, but there is certainly a valuing of certain characteristics which historically are viewed as being masculine. So yes, and I think where this isn't to limit women's inclusion, but it is to identify that the kind of ideology here, the kind of values that are being espoused are in response to a perceived sort of weakness. And so and this is a nuanced thing because, you know, historically strength and masculinity are often associated, but that doesn't necessarily, again, correlate to actual gender roles of individuals or of societies. So yeah, thank you. So where that leads us is I wanted to kind of focus on this idea of the Sabra and the construction of a new Israeli identity. So Sabra is a term that was popularized around the 1930s in what was then known as Palestine, historical Palestine, to denote a Jew who was actually born in the land. So rather than a Jew who emigrated to the promised land as they saw it, a Jew who actually, his parents had probably emigrated and who was born and raised on the land. And I mean, I think many of us are familiar with the hummus at the very least, which is, they're supremely spicy, is my favorite. But the word sabra, it refers to a thorny desert plant, like a prickly pear that has this thick skin, which conceals a sweet and softer interior. And so this kind of becomes part of the national identity that is being fostered in these early Jewish settlements. And so there was an interesting study that I drew from here in kind of laying out tonight's lecture. This book by Philip Hollander, From Shlemiel to Sabra, Zionist Masculinity and Palestinian Hebrew Literature. And so Hollander talks about how for the new Jewish man to arise in Palestine, elements of diasporic Jewish masculinity, especially those evoked by the Yiddish term Shlemiel, an awkward, clumsy person, a blunderer, a born loser, a dope or drip, needed to be eradicated. So only this would enable the new Jewish man, rugged and rooted in the land, like the sabra cactus, and externally prickly with a sweet interior, like a sabra fruit, bit of a run-on sentence there, to emerge. And so what we see again here is this contrast between the older quote unquote weaker Jew, and this new national identity that is being fostered and inculcated within these early Zionist settlements. And so the images that I have here, I have like an actual prickly pear sabra plant with the Israeli flags there, as well as this illustrated representation of the sabra, this character Srulik, who's very well known in Israel, and he's shown wearing shorts, sandals, and a tembel hat, which is like, again, another kind of iconic like Zionist early the kibbutznikim and the chalutzim, the pioneers, wore these particular kind of hats, and so it's kind of this iconic characterization in this illustration here. And that brings us, I guess, to kibbutzim as well. So kibbutzim, and this is to kind of go back to Aaron's question about how women would have been and were included in the building and the fostering of a kind of masculinized identity. There is this emphasis on equality and egalitarianism that we see in the early kibbutz artsy movement. And so kibbutzim, the first is founded in 1910, and they're founded as these models for egalitarian society, as communal farms. Is everyone's familiar with kibbutzim in general, right? If anyone has any questions, please feel free to chime in.
Simon, can I just interrupt for a second?
Yeah, for sure.
I haven't seen any of these illustrations you've been talking about coming across on the screen. Did you?
Are they not coming up?
Because I'm not getting any of
the images aren't showing up here where my cursor is.
Not that I'm getting. No.
You may have to hide the participants' windows to see the pictures.
I have to do that.
You have to minimize the participants. If you have the participants' pictures showing, they're hiding the images. Do you know how to do that?
No, that's okay. I'll just.
There's a little on the top of the participants list. There's a little blue line.
You slide it over. If you're on a computer,
no, I'm on my phone, so maybe it's because I'm on my phone.
Oh, it's because you're on your phone, I think.
Okay, thank you. Sorry to interrupt.
No worries. I would have wanted to make sure that if we are sharing the video later, all of these images should be there. So definitely we can get those to you if anyone, Nan, if you want to email me, I can send you the actual slideshow as well, if that would help afterwards. So anyway, coming back to this idea of this development of a new Jewish ideal, with this notion of the Sabra as strong, as very physical, muscular, working the land. There is like this new connotation of what it means to be a Jew in this new kind of world on this new land versus the kind of persecution that Jews were facing in Eastern Europe and the perceived weakness that they were attributed with. So returning to the kibbutzim, there's another image there of people on early kibbutzim. There's some women, it's like all women there, I believe, and they're working the land. And so the kibbutz really sought to reimagine social institutions on a kind of collective basis. And so there was this big emphasis, as many of us likely know, on dismantling the nuclear family in favor of a collective group identity. And so one place where we see this play out is in the children's home, or the Gan Yeladim, that was on many early kibbutzim, where they actually separated out parents from their children. All of the children lived together communally, and they would only see their actual parents and nuclear families, once a week or so. And so this was intended in part to kind of equalize and naturalize what are often gendered roles of parenting, to make everything in the community a particular job that can be interchangeable, that everyone is responsible for, rather than, okay, the father makes money and the wife stays at home with the kid. This way, women could also take part in the actual work of the kibbutz. Also, the children's homes would have had many women working there, but it would have been one of the many duties and one of the many jobs on the kibbutzim, rather than relegating them to just their individual homes. Yes, it was heavily influenced by the socialist movement. And so this ideology of from each according to his ability, from each according to his needs, is Marxist. And so, yeah, the early settlement of the land by the kibbutz artsy movement was very much influenced by these socialist and often utopian visions of sort of this balanced society. And so on the one hand, there is this question, well, will this kind of liberate women from these constraints of motherhood, of being limited in the home? And ultimately, as we, I think, all probably know, these children's homes did not pan out long term. And this is no longer what happens on the kibbutzim that are left. Children live with their parents, and the nuclear family was not entirely dismantled. And so I have this quote of collective education, which was also part of these children's homes, can be regarded as a failure. The family as the basic social unit has not been abolished in kibbutzim. But familistic trends have been stronger than ever, and kibbutz parents have reclaimed their rights to care for their own children. And so you see this kind of push and pull of how far in a kind of egalitarian direction you can go without also undermining the things about parenthood and about family life that people really need. So there's a lot of really interesting conversations and work that's been done on these children's houses. But I thought it was important to note that in terms of the kibbutz movement and thinking about how gender is and gender roles are being assigned and maintained in the early Jewish settlements, that there is this push towards this radical communal society, and yet this doesn't seem to really pan out long term. And something else that I thought was worth noting as well is this tendency in some of the early Zionist literature of an agrarian kind of rural focused ideal. So A.D. Gordon is one particular Zionist figure who is associated with the kibbutz movement, and there is this ideology of the land as this kind of feminine being entity, kind of like how we gender, ships and cars. The land itself is feminine and actually, I said virginous, I think I meant virginal. And that by working the land, there is kind of this presumed impregnation of the land's virginity with this new masculine life. And so actually the population on this dry land, this desert, the planting of trees, the farming, this agrarian lifestyle has these sort of sexual connotations as well. And so I thought that was interesting to note, even in terms of kind of what is intended to be a gender and socially, economically egalitarian society. There are still these motifs, these images that are highly gendered that come to play into how the people's relationship to the land was understood. So there we have a little bit on some of the kind of pre-Israel settlement history and how gender is kind of being played with in interesting ways prior to the creation of the state of Israel. And I kind of wanted to then move us into the actual formation of the state of Israel, and the ways in which the country's Jewish character also has implications on how gender is to be understood and how women and men are to be treated in this new country. So in 1947, as Ben Gurion is negotiating as the UN is trying to figure out what to do with the land of then what was British Palestine. So Ben Gurion makes this concession and this promise to the more orthodox religious political authorities in the land, that Jewish laws will be protected. So he was really trying to get everybody on his side in order to get the state of Israel off the ground. And he makes this commitment that Jewish laws will be protected in the Jewish state on the basis of these 4 key tenets. So one being Shabbat, that Shabbat will be the legal day of rest. One being that every state-run kitchen for the use of Jews serves kosher food. And what's really important to us here is the commitment to marital law, that all marital law for Jewish people living in the state of Israel will go through religious courts rather than civil ones. And this is to satisfy the deep need of the religiously observant, lest the house of Israel be divided into 2. So we also see religious education as another thing that Ben Gurion promises. But it's particularly the marital law that is going to pose some complications and issues for contemporary Jewish women, particularly. So one of these sort of implications that we see is that of the aguna. Is anyone familiar with the term aguna? I have it defined, but I can go over it really quickly. So a married woman who is separated from her husband, but she cannot remarry, either because she can't obtain a divorce yet from him, or because it's unknown whether or not he is alive. And basically this comes from biblical law, but because marriage is for Jews in the state of Israel is legislated through the religious courts, this leaves a lot of women who aren't able to procure the get, where their husbands do not want to divorce them, do not want to grant them that document. It leaves them effectively, the term means like chained or tied down to these men. And so this, as I mentioned, is a really complex issue in Talmudic law, and it becomes this modern issue in Israel as marital law falls under the precinct of religious courts. And there's a short video that I thought would be interesting. So I'm going to share this and make it full screen. So hopefully everyone can see.
In 1908, a little-known 20-year-old writer published a story about a failed marriage. He called it Agunot, and based on the story, used the pseudonym Shai Agnon. In 1966, Shmuel Yosef Agnon, using the name he kept from the very first story, won the Nobel Prize in Literature for his profoundly characteristic narrative art with motifs from the life of the Jewish people. Originally, the term aguna was used to describe a woman in a marriage where it could not be determined if the husband was alive. Jewish law does not allow someone to remarry without a divorce document, known as a get. Without evidence that the husband is deceased and without a get document, women could be chained to a marriage that they couldn't even be sure still existed. Nowadays, the issue of agunot has expanded far beyond those original cases. A husband must divorce his wife of his own volition. He cannot be forced. If a husband refuses to give a get, even if we know for certain that he is alive and even if we know exactly where he lives, a woman held hostage in such a dead marriage is an aguna. She needs a divorce document to remarry, and her husband refuses to grant one. Agnon's story is not about these kinds of cases of agunot. It's not about when the husband's status cannot be determined, and it is not about an instance where a recalcitrant husband refused to grant a get. Instead, it's about a marriage between Dina, the daughter of a wealthy Jerusalem family, and Ezekiel, a Polish scholar who was brought to Jerusalem in order to marry Dina. But both Dina and Ezekiel are interested in someone else. Dina is in love with an artist named Ben Uri, and Ezekiel is in love with a girl from home in Poland. Far from the contemporary issue of Aguna, the story of Dina and Ezekiel touches upon a broader issue: estrangement. The dissonance inside a marriage, the alienation of being in a new land, the distance between the love in one's heart and the actual context of our lives. As literary critic Adam Kirsch wrote about this story in The New Yorker, the most shocking thing about Agunot, given the time and the place in which it was written, is that it portrays another kind of failed marriage between Jewish immigrants and the land of Israel. Ezekiel, who represents the best of Eastern European Judaism, its piety, devotion, and intellectual power, cannot find happiness in Jerusalem. Quoting from the story, "His feet are planted in the gates of Jerusalem and stand on her soil, but his eyes and his heart are pledged to houses of study and worship abroad. And even now, as he walked in the hills of Jerusalem, he fancies himself among the scholars of his own town, strolling in the fields to take the evening air." In many ways, it is the underlying dissonance that the story addresses that makes the contemporary plight of Agunot all the more relevant. Dalia Oziel, a 25-year-old social media influencer, began a movement highlighting the plight of modern Agunot. Within a few weeks, social media feeds were flooded with the hashtag #FreeChava, bringing attention to a woman whose husband was refusing to give her a get. More and more people got involved, both men and women, and the fight to free Agunot, sometimes conducted through demonstrations outside the homes of get refusers, took on a whole new light and urgency on social media platforms. Alongside this incredible groundspring of support bubbled up conversations about broader issues, including the boundaries of halachic innovation and gender distinctions in Judaism, all within the very modern world of social media. Of course, the confluence of issues should not distract from the plight of actual women trapped in broken marriages, but the emergence of these issues together feel reminiscent of Ezekiel standing firmly in Jerusalem, wondering if he will ever return to the world he left. Negotiating between these worlds, old and new, remains a theme throughout modern religious life. Agnon's story begins with midrashic imagery. God is described as weaving a talus with the thread of the deeds of the Jewish people. This talus is meant to wrap Knesset Yisrael, the congregation of the Jewish people. But if the behavior of the Jewish people is not loving, is not gracious, is not empathetic, then the thread of this grand talus begins to fray and could even tear. And perhaps that's what we are still contending with, creating a collective talus through our communal support, love, and graciousness that can protect the Jewish people in worlds old and new.
Sorry, that did not meant to start again. There we go. All right. So any sort of thoughts on the video, on this question of Agunot? I thought that the story sort of helped illustrate something that I was also trying to emphasize a bit of this kind of old versus new dichotomy, and these ideas of how gender plays into Israeli identity, and how also, on the other hand, these very real political decisions and accommodations, have implications for women living in the state. So Lynn, you had something to add, to say?
Yeah, can you see me first of all?
Yes.
Okay, I'm on a different device because I was having a lot of trouble on my laptop, but the functionality is different on this device and I can't see anybody but you. But so when we read that part of the Talmud, we sort of thought like the whole Talmudic world is this ancient patriarchal world. And so the reason this whole Agunot thing feels uncomfortable to us is because it's an ancient regimen that's been brought forth into the modern world when in theory, women are equal to men, but it's this very unequal hegemony that persists. But on the other hand, if you look at ancient cultures, allowing a woman to get out of a marriage through the institution of divorce is actually very forward thinking compared to others. Can you imagine in some of these, currently existing patriarchal cultures, do you think that wives in Iran have the opportunity to get a divorce from their husband if the marriage is falling apart? I mean, I don't know. I don't know anything about it. Maybe they do. Do wives in India, can they divorce their wives? I mean, can husbands divorce wives in India? So I think compared to the ancient world, the whole divorce thing is forward thinking. But yeah, the reason that agunot thing feels uncomfortable is because basically it's a vestigial thing from the ancient world, you know.
Right. Yeah, thank you. I think that's a really important point there. And something that, we're always thinking of is what is the context in which something like this would have been created, and in what ways does it make sense to carry on, an allegiance to these law codes. And so there is kind of a discord between this idea of continuity and of adhering to Jewish law in all cases when it comes to marriage, and the actual lived reality of women in a society, in a time and a place where divorce is not uncommon, is often necessary, and the real harm that it can do in the ancient world. Something we talked about, even going back to the first lecture we did, with the story of Tamar. She was in a very precarious place as a widow without a husband, because she was living in a world where your only role and place to be was in the home of a beit of, in the father's home, whether it's your natal father of birth, or whether it's the father's home of your husband. And so for Tamar, being in this liminal sort of no man's land, going back to the home of her father after she was a married woman, that puts her in a really vulnerable position. And so the rules for like levirate marriage, for example, which is where this idea of the aguna is also related to, is actually meant as a kind of protective measure for a woman in that kind of circumstance. But we're no longer living in a world where these kinds of machinations are always helpful or necessary. Very much the opposite in a case like this, where for example, many women who are being abused in their marriages, it's a further form of abuse for a man to not grant her the divorce that she so desperately needs. And so, in what set of circumstances and what perspectives were these laws conceived of, and sort of developed by the rabbis later on as well? And how much we talked last week as well about kind of the hypothetical what if nature of a lot of rabbinic thought, of like, well, if this happened and this happened, there's a lot of kind of thought exercises, and it's not always clear. Like we talked about these different identities of and experiences of gender that the rabbis talk about. And in that case, there seems to be some awareness that there are people who are different from just man, woman, but a lot of this circumstantial sort of experimentation and thought processes very much do seem hypothetical, and not always, what's actually reflective of how people were and would be living. So when it comes to the application of these laws to a modern society, I think we see this disconnect very clearly. Any other sort of thoughts or questions on this?
I was hoping to explore a little bit more about how people who don't fit the binary construct fit into Jewish life. And in this country, there's so many different Jewish communities, and I assume in Canada as well, that whoever a person is, they can find a Jewish community where they'll feel welcomed and comfortable.
Yeah.
The Israel Committee had an event a couple of years ago about two Israeli male soldiers who had an affair, and then one of them died, and then the sequel was about what happened to the other one. And with that movie, and they kind of talked about it, the gay male relationship wasn't widely accepted. They were, to some extent, people kind of knew about it and they didn't know about it. It was pretty closeted. But then they also showed us a companion film about life in Tel Aviv.
Right.
And it's the gayborhood, basically, and a very modern life that, might be similar to life in New York, where whoever you are, you can be who you are. And I just wonder, you may not know because you don't live in Israel. I wonder, in other parts of Israel, are people of different identities as accepted as they are in like Tel Aviv or New York?
Yeah, that's a good question. And actually, my next slide is kind of looking at that question of inclusion, and also when we think of marital law, how homosexuality and other sexual orientations play into all of that. So I think, let's see, right, let's try to play again. I'm trying to move to the next slide. Oopsie. There we go. So another sort of question here that I think, and we'll come back to your question, Lynn, I think it's related to this point. So I want to keep that front of mind and return to it. Is this question of how accepting Israel is for queer people, for non-traditional, shall we say, marriage. So I think on the one hand, as you identified rightly, like in places like Tel Aviv, where there is this urban center, there's a lot of sort of sexual diversity. There is a lot of room for acceptance. And, this image here is of Pride Parade in Tel Aviv, and you see the Israeli flag on the left. If you can see the image, sorry, if it was Nan who couldn't see it, but you will later. And then on the right-hand side, there's a rainbow flag with the flag of Israel mixed in with that. So you see the Magen David over top of the rainbow flag. And I think that on the one hand, there is definitely pretty widespread acceptance in an urban center like Tel Aviv, but different parts of the country and different areas, there's, this is not uniform. So Shoshana is asking, can two gay Israelis leave the country to get married and have it be recognized in Israel? So yes, essentially because of the reliance on the Jewish marital laws, gay marriage cannot happen through Jewish courts. And so for any Jews who want to get married to a same-sex partner, they cannot actually do that properly in following the religious laws. But if you get married somewhere else, Israel recognizes marriages performed outside of the country and does grant full recognition of same-sex marriages. So it's just interesting, and I thought worth noting as well. Right now, in particular, there has been this critique that coming towards Israel, that Israel sort of uses its openness towards LGBTQ people as a shield for what are perceived to be human rights violations against the Palestinians. And this phenomenon is often referred to as pinkwashing. And kind of just, really playing up and emphasizing the liberal Western ideals and the acceptance of queer people. But even many queer advocates will also say, well, Jews aren't the only ones here. And so there's this kind of push and pull where on the one hand, it is probably one of the most accepting places if you're in Tel Aviv, in the Middle East, to be a queer person. On the other hand, marriage equality is not really guaranteed. If you are married, you can be equal, but actually getting that status is a little bit trickier. And I think it's also important to take stock of the ways in which progressive values and do not necessarily carry over across all fields. And so, Tel Aviv might be a great place to be a queer person in many ways, but that's not necessarily the case in the old city of Jerusalem or in a smaller village an hour outside of Tel Aviv. And at the same time, just being aware of this conversation that's happening among human rights advocates, especially in North America and Europe, this idea of Israel as a safe haven for LGBTQ folks there is validity, there is something to be taken from that, but it's also, very much the case that there have been criticisms that what is this perhaps negating, and how there can be sort of true equality when certain segments of a population are still not seen as equal. And Shoshana asked, do these gay marriages have the same rights as folks married halachically? So I think civilly, yes, they do. They just would not. Part of the issue here as well is that even for, as far as I understand it, for conversions, for anything that is related to the Jewish courts, it's really only the Orthodox courts that exactly that count as in a certain sense. And so even though there are plenty of denominations and sects of Judaism where gay marriage is fine, where all of these things are accepted, there is still this adherence to a very rigid sense of Jewish identity, and that is itself can be traced back, not wholly, but in large part as well, to the legal structures of the actual state and the granting of those legal powers to the Jewish courts, which themselves are not necessarily representative of all the Jews living in Israel, and certainly not many Jews living in the diaspora. Lynn, are you asking about the Supreme Court in Israel?
Well, no, yeah. So Aaron said, isn't gay marriage still illegal in some states in this country? And I thought that the Supreme Court some years ago, made a decision that said you can't ban gay marriage, but maybe I don't remember it correctly. I don't know. Somebody will know. So it was a while ago, 2014, Shoshana said.
Are we thinking of of DOMA?
Right. They said DOMA is not constitutional, that we have to recognize marriage between two consenting adults.
Yeah, it's now a federal right. It's across the whole country that gay marriage is.
Yeah. It's not state by state. They won't perform them. Yeah, but I don't know. That means the town clerk might not issue a marriage license, is what you're saying, right? But they can go in the church or the justice of the peace or the temple or wherever they find someone empowered to marry you, and I guess they can do it. Are you saying that it's still legal, that you can't get there are lots of, so let's see.
Yeah.
That's Canadian.
I'm just saying if I have a detail wrong.
So all the provincial governments in Canada permit anyone who wants to get married, basically.
Yes.
Yeah.
Although, we're still seeing the same right-leaning movements taking hold. So, whatever happens in the US to a large extent gets mirrored and kind of, I guess, goes upstream if we're going north and south. So, it's hard to say. I think big picture, yes. But anyway, I thought that was important. And I also wanted to kind of end with a conversation. So just before we move on from from that last slide, Lynn, I wanted to kind of just emphasize that we are going to be coming back a bit more to the experiences of queer and trans Jews next week, when we're talking more about diaspora Judaism in the modern world. I kind of wanted to emphasize tonight the ways in which in Israel there are these certain constraints, and we definitely see constraints in North America, for example, but there is just a lot more there are many more opportunities and options for how to be Jewish, sort of in a legal sense almost, whereas Judaism on legal grounds is very much defined and regulated by Orthodox authorities on behalf of Israel. So there's a bit of a difference there, but we are definitely going to come back next week to some of the ways in which queer folks are sort of expressing their Judaism, and it's something that is actually a particular research interest of mine. So I'm excited to talk more with you all about that next week. So I'm guessing many of us also are familiar here with Women at the Wall. But is anyone familiar and wants to share a little bit of Women at the Wall and their kind of mission and raison d'etre? Or should I presume that we don't have knowledge? I don't want to bore you if someone else can do a better
we've
job.
all heard of them. I mean, I don't think we know the details, but they're a group of progressive women in Israel who go to pray at the Western Wall. And there's a section where women are allowed to go, but occasionally there's someone intrudes in the women's section, or the women go over to the men's section, and then fisticuffs ensue. And it's just not a very, they might show up carrying a Torah that they want to pray with, and then the soldiers or police who are stationed there sometimes allow brawls to take place when violence happens. They don't always try to stop the violence. That's my understanding of what's going on.
I would say that's pretty spot on. I think, again, where I kind of wanted to emphasize this is that in 1967, when Israel actually got access to the old city of Jerusalem and to the Western Wall, the keys to the Western Wall and the authority over that area. This was all granted to Orthodox religious governmental authorities. And so you saw a partition placed to separate men and women. And there was the Protection of Holy Places law, which really put limits and parameters, both sort of physical and mental, for women's prayer. And so there were requirements for women who did want to pray to be there in silence, no group prayer. They were not permitted to wear talitut, and they were not permitted to carry Torah scrolls. And so the Women of the Wall began as a kind of protest movement in 1988 to fight against that in support of women's equality in prayer, and really focusing on, the rights that everyone should have to practice and exercise their religion, and particularly their Judaism in the Jewish state, and in what is commonly appreciated as the holiest of sites. So there is this kind of conflict between. So Shoshana asks, are other denominations recognized in Israel? Do they have any power? I know that there is also there is a reform movement. My understanding is that legally, it's predominantly the Orthodox authorities that have the governmental power. There are other kinds of congregations and communities, but in terms of, I think even some of the right of return and stuff, like the way if someone's a convert, or if someone had Jewish ancestry and wants to prove that, it needs to be done in accordance with the Orthodox courts rather than other sects and denominations. And so there is really.
I just wanted to comment on that for a second.
Yeah.
I just mean, sorry, I'm just doing on my phone. I'm not able to do things that what I normally can do.
That's all right.
I'm a convert, and my understanding I'm a Reform convert, and my understanding is that I have the right of return. This was legalized in 2016 or something. As someone who converted in the United States, I have the right of return to go to Israel. But if I had converted in the state of Israel to being a Reformed Jew, I would not have any of the full rights of return.
Yeah, thank you for that perspective, because I again, it's one of those things that's messy, and it's kind of similar as well to the recognition of same-sex marriages, but at the same time, those cannot happen through the Jewish court system in Israel. So there is very messy and unsettling in many ways, because especially for anyone who is converting to Judaism, that is not a simple process. And so anyone who is willing and able to partake in that process should very much be recognized. And so, I mean, on the one hand, it's good that there is that recognition for people outside to enter Israel. But again, we see this kind of this mishigas, this mess here in a way that is really, we can still see the links to the kind of accordances made at the foundation of the state. And so even after a Supreme Court battle that ended in 2003, where the court instructed the government to build a prayer space for women's prayer, there were then sort of complaints made that the space was not actually created in accordance with the verdict of the Supreme Court. And so there have been ongoing clashes, ongoing legal battles, well past 2003. And I think many of us have seen and heard news over the last number of years. So this is still very much an ongoing issue for religious women who want to be able to pray in full equality with men. That is still not fully a possibility. Shoshana, I agree. The idea that someone has to prove their Judaism to a particular standard, it does feel repugnant. And that is very much, I can tell, not the vibe at the community that we're fostering right here. And unfortunately, you know, that's not always true everywhere. And so the Women of the Wall, on their website and their mission, they call this issue the greatest symbol for the exclusion of women in the public sphere in Israel. So I thought that was just a kind of illuminating quote to highlight the significance of this issue. And I wanted to just sort of end with this very quick 1-minute video, and we can have some time if anyone has any further thoughts or questions. But I thought it was just, this is from the Women of the Wall's YouTube page. I just see there's chat. Lynn says, you have read that the authorities in Israel don't recognize everyone's conversions or natal identities as Jews. Yeah, I think that is also the case. So we're gonna end with this video that is a little bit more tongue-in-cheek, and we can certainly stay on for a couple minutes for any further questions.
I'm calling Rabbi Rabinovich, who's been the rabbi of the wall for 30 years. He's not answering. It's not the first time that he hasn't answered. In fact, he hasn't spoken to me directly in 30 years. I will leave him a message. Rabbi, it's Rosh Chodesh Sivan. It's the new month of the Torah, giving the Torah. I want to know, why is it so critical for you to prevent women from reading the Torah on this note? Do you realize that historically you'll be judged for preventing Jewish women from reading Torah? How could you privilege yourself? I'm also wondering, what's so threatening about it? What would happen in the world if women read Torah? What would happen if they were rabbis? What if a woman was the rabbi of the wall? I can see how your world was pondering just thinking about that. Anyway, I'm wishing you Shavuot Sameach, a meaningful Shavuot, and maybe take a moment to meditate on this question. How you made your life's career to prevent Jewish women and Jewish girls from touching and reading Torah. Chag Sameach.
So anyway, that's really where I'm going to leave you off. I see we're almost at time. But I really appreciated that message and that call to kind of action. And that just remembering that, you know, the fact that this woman rabbi is able to be at the wall making that statement, making that call on her cell phone is on one hand somewhat radical for especially the people with whom she's trying to reach. But at the same time, the fact that she has to make that call means that we still have so much further to go. And I just want to kind of leave us
Thank you
with
for showing it
that.
to us. Thank
Yeah.
you for showing it to us.
I couldn't see it or hear it. I don't know what
Oh.
happened.
Oh, sorry.
Oh,
I might
well,
be something with this.
maybe you can play it again
I will
next week.
I will email the presentation to
Okay.
Ellis, so that if you don't want to go back to the video, you can also peruse through the slides. How about that?
It was
Yeah.
wonderful. It
I
was
might
wonderful.
not be here next week too. I'm going to be away.
All right. Okay. Well, we'll miss you.
All right. I'm not sure
but
what's going on with this.
Thank you,
Oh, there it
everybody,
is.
for sticking through with our technological problems.
Yeah, I see it. I see it.
Yeah.
There's just one more week of
One more week,
session.
yeah. And if
Right?
anybody, I think last week too, if anyone missed it, I think we had a good conversation last week. So I really appreciated the time and kind of what we covered in a very short time. So definitely, if anyone missed that, I would recommend you go back. And we have one more week together.
Yeah, the recordings are on our website and they will include these little videos that Simon has shown as well. So you can see it that way. And I will also send around the slides for anyone who wants to have the slides.
We ought to make that available to our Connections women's group. That little video.
Yeah, it's a good video. Thank you, Simon.
All right. Thank you all. Have a good
Thank you
week.
so much.
And still Chag Sameach. Happy Hanukkah.
Chag Sameach.
Bye now.
Chag Sameach.